I am Bobby Kinnear, and I'm a member of the Westmont Foundation Board, and that is the board that sponsors the Westmont Downtown series. And this is, of course, conversations about things that matter. We've been sponsoring this since 2005. In fact, I think we started it in 2005. And it is an amazing event because we get to highlight our professors, and they are fabulous at the Westmont College. And we also get to talk to you, or you get to hear what the latest and the greatest is of what's going on that's in our community or in our nation, or maybe the world. So this is a series. It's a gift to the community from Westmont College. This is the last talk for 2011-12 series, but don't fear. We're starting up again for 4 more wonderful talks next fall. So don't fear, and I hope you all will be here. I do have the honor to introduce Professor Patty Hunter, who in turn will introduce our speaker tonight, Santa Barbara Poet Laureate Paul Willis. And I want to say that Professor Hunter is a graduate at Westmont. She earned a master's degree and doctorate in mathematics from University of Virginia. I might not have gone to one of her classes. Professor Hunter has taught at Westmont since 2000 and was honored with the Teacher of the Year Award in 2007. 2009, she co-directed the program Westmont in Mexico, and she also is the interim vice provost for this academic year, 2011-2012. So thank you, Dr. Hunter, and thank you, Paul, too.
Thanks, Bobby. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend and neighbor and colleague tonight. Paul Willis is beginning his 2nd year as Santa Barbara's Poet Laureate and about to finish his 24th year as a professor of English at Westmont College. Paul has a PhD from Washington State University in English and many poems and essays and novels to his credit, some of which are going to be on sale at that table afterward, and Paul's going to be over there signing things, so take advantage of that. One thing I love about Paul's poems is they give us a glimpse into his own life and experiences, but at the same time they draw us in and make us feel that we've had some of those experiences too. The first time I heard Paul read some of his poems was to a group of scholarship students at a dinner at the home of Westmont's president. We were having this dinner in honor of the students, and Paul was the after-dinner entertainment. And the students sat there on the floor of the president's living room listening with rapt attention to Paul read. But one of them came up to me afterward and sort of sheepishly confessed, well, when I heard we were coming to dinner at the president's house and then listening to someone read poems afterward, well, I just wasn't sure what to make of that, but now I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this because it seems sort of nerdy, but wow, that was great. So every time I hear Paul read his poems, I think without any embarrassment whatsoever at the nerdiness that, wow, that was great. So I'm quite sure we're going to enjoy what we have to hear tonight. So will you please join me in welcoming Poet Laureate and Professor Paul Willis.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Bobby, and I hope we will enjoy being nerdy together today. Well, we are in the middle of National Poetry Month, which is celebrated in a big way in Santa Barbara. I put some flyers out on the tables. This is one of about, I think, 21 events this month throughout the city. So take a look, and this may not be your last chance to be nerdy in April. I have taught at Westmont for 24 years, and Patty was trying to give you a sense of my effectiveness there. I thought it was better for you to hear what my students have had to say. this is the time of year as we get near the end of the semester that students fill out class evaluation forms about us, and then later in the summer we get to read them. And I was so intrigued by one set from an introduction to literature class that I created a poem out of lines from this set of class evaluations. This is what you call a found poem. You find the lines out there, and sort of like Tony Askew's assemblage. Class evaluation. If only he would engage us more, ask the right questions, we would respond. We would love literature. As it is, he putters around, often appears to lose track. There very seldom seems to be a main point. Nothing really to put in your notes. And anyone can say what they want, which is fine if it's one of us, but the others, he should correct them more. On papers, though, he's never open to anybody's interpretation. It always has to be his own, whatever that is, because he never tells you. We shouldn't do so many poems, just stories. And one Shakespeare is enough. He's pretty hard to read, you know. They all are. What this class really needs is videos. It's asking a lot for us to get this stuff from a book. Also, he should leave more time to discuss and let us go a few minutes early. Thank you. Well, I imagine some of you are here out of your loyalty to the Westmont Downtown series, and your own relationship to poetry may be tenuous. So I want to bring you in a little bit. I was helping with Santa Barbara Writers Conference poetry workshop a few years ago, and a woman came. She was originally from Norway, working in Los Angeles. I asked her why she had come to the poetry workshop, and she gave me this answer, which I tried to write down in her own words. So called the poem Day Job. What I do is make subtitles in Norwegian. Not easy. Take The Simpsons, for example. So much wordplay, the double meanings won't come through. But we don't get paid to do good work. We throw up something approximate or even largely inaccurate, and the supervisor says, good enough. The important thing is to get to the next episode. That's why I have to write on the side, take time to revise. On the job, no one lets me. I miss that. And poetry, more than anything, is about the exact word. When I find it, then I can go to sleep at night. So it's finding that exact word or that exact color, that exact note, that exact dance move, that exact number even. I guess I would concede even that. But I think we know that feeling of reaching for just the right thing to express ourselves in that moment, and that's part of what poetry is. I think poetry also reaches deep into our childhoods. This is something John Ridland was reminding me of years ago. When you think of the way we grew up with rhymes and jump rope songs and things, And we take such delight in chanting these things, you know, Miss Sue, Miss Sue, Miss Sue from Alabama, sitting in a rocker, eating Betty Crocker, on and on. And my daughter would have things to go with it that I could never. But so there's this pleasure of language that perhaps we abandon. Sometimes I think the worst thing that our grade school teachers do to us is convince us to stop moving our lips as we read. Because language is a physical pleasure. Every poet has his or her favorite words. For Emily Dickinson, it was gingerbread. She would say, gingerbread. Now, there's a word to lift your hat to. And so when you're reading poetry, read it aloud. At least move your lips. Feel that pleasure. I was asked to visit a grade school classroom when our children were younger and work with some poetry with the kids. And I didn't know quite what to do. We have quite a wonderful group of people in town who work as poets in the schools. So I went to visit one of Perry Longo's classrooms, and Perry's one of our former laureates in town. And she was working with letters and numbers, which children like to animate and personify. Okay, so what do you think about the number 3 and the letter Z and so forth? And so I wrote this poem about the number 4 in a grade school classroom. I think it was Peabody School here. 4, says Jung, is the perfect number. That's why the church venerates Mary, because the Trinity wasn't enough. The feminine 4th leaf on the clover, wafting behind the 4 dread horsemen. That's why there are 4 gospels and 4 states on the West Coast and 4 years between presidents, except for the ones who happen to die in person or in reputation. That is why the years leap every 4th February, and why a mile takes 4 laps and 4 minutes to run if you're fast. That's why there are 4 seasons and 4 limbs on the human body, and why the thumb is different from the other fingers, the odd one out. That's why there are 4 people in my house, 4 walls around us, and 4 corners to this page. When I go, that's why there will only be 4 hairs left on my head. God, I think, will still be counting quaternally. Now, I heard you hesitate when I said there are 4 states on the West Coast, but Alaska, right? Okay, there we go. Well, I want to read you a poem. I don't think I've ever read this out loud before. It's not published, and you'll probably see why on both counts. It starts in Lucumber Plaza and goes back into childhood. It's called In the Parking Lot. A man in the next car eats fried chicken, wipes his hands on a newspaper, wads it up, tosses it onto the asphalt. I used to confront that kind, pick up the trash and say, I think you dropped this. But waiting here in the parking lot, watching the sunlight smear the dust in arcs across the windshield, I want to congratulate this fellow for putting something on the ground the wind can make use of. He's probably waiting for his wife, too. And no telling when his or mine will emerge again from the doors of Macy's. There is always the invitation, of course, to accompany her, but who would want to risk the chance of having to try on a new sport coat, or tasseled loafers, or to ponder those elusive numbers of waist and collar and inseam? My bleakest memories from childhood are of prowling through circular racks of skirts as if they were head-high ferns in a jungle, except they weren't. And all the while, my mother taking her sweet time, holding up blouses as if they were gifts, 40% off from the gods. Come on, I said, tugging at the back of her knee, but my mother never seemed to notice. Something about a department store would deprive her of her sense of hearing. So I am filled with sympathy as I watch my neighbor's clump of news gust away like a tumbleweed toward those glassy doors in the distance. A desperate message from both of us, sent afloat from our desert islands, asking for help, asking for some decent rescue. Now that poem simply proves what all women know, is that men are children. I think so. Okay. Well, if that was the bleakest, saddest memory of my childhood, I think I had a pretty good childhood. And I want to make it up to my mother here. I'll make it up to my wife a little later in the reading. Here's a little rainy day poem for today. It's about being young, growing up in Oregon, where it's often like today. It's called Getting Well. Toast will scratch a sore throat, my mother says, stirring yet another can of tomato soup. The air is sudden bright beyond the patio, illuminating gray-green lichen up and down the Douglas fir. The trunk is sodden. I can see the cedar shakes, mossed, steaming upon the roof, making clouds while the sun shines. The soup arrives in aqua plastic, soda crackers on the side. The sky goes dark. Rain settles across the window as if demanding to cool my tongue, slow comfort easing into the mouth of home. Well, obviously, if that poem's any good, you're not thinking about my mother or my being a little bit sick. You're thinking of your own mother, I hope, and times when she brought out the Melmac with the soup and so forth. As I think about that poem, it's not about anything spectacular, and I don't think poetry needs to reach for spectacular subjects. It's about the ordinary. I think of a poem as just a new way of being in the same place. It's a little bit of a trail you can make that others can follow, but hopefully the trail will bring them where they are. One thing I want to do today is talk a little bit about poets who have influenced me. It's a question that any reader gets. And when I'm asked that question, I talk about the three Williams: William Shakespeare, William Wordsworth, and William Stafford. And I'll read a poem from each of these writers, and then maybe read another poem that in some way imitates at least the spirit of that writer. And that's how we learn to write, just by imitating. That's how we learn to do most anything. So how about Sonnet 30 by Shakespeare. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye, unused to flow, for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances foregone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I new pay, as if not paid before. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored, and sorrows end. Now, I think that's a poem that takes part in the tradition of elegy. An elegy, I think, is one of the oldest impulses of poetry. It's the impulse to lament and to seek consolation. And that is a lamenting speaker telling his woes and moaning his moans. And there's that consolation of thinking of the friend at the end of the poem that's so hard-earned and sweet. I think of Virgil, who says in the Aeneid, there are tears in things. And I think of Shakespeare again in Macbeth, who says, give sorrow words. And I think of Jesus, who tells us, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It seems to me that poetry can be a very deep part of that necessary process of being human. I was talking to a student this morning who stayed after class, in an intro class, and she said, I notice you get choked up a little bit sometimes when you're reading. And, that happens to me sometimes too, but I don't know if it's okay. And I don't see my friends doing that. All my friends are pre-med. And they don't cry when they read things. And I'm worried something's wrong with me, she said. It was so sweet. It was so sweet. So here's a bit of an elegy. It starts simply with something I read in the Santa Barbara News Press. It's called Possible Endings. The paper said she was struck twice in the back of the thigh by an arm-thick rattlesnake. It left no poison, no use killing what it couldn't eat. Soon after, already snake-stricken, the same woman was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 42. Almost anything can occur at 42, though that was a year I personally happened to survive. Our retriever died of a lump inside his jaw last month. He was nearly 11. We laid him on the grass and felt his welcome breathing disappear. A man I once climbed mountains with is scheduled to leave this world and his wife and daughter after his next birthday. Lymphoma. He called to say he was so sorry about our dog. I think he enjoyed the chance to express some sympathy. I wrote him a letter after that, possibly my last to him. I didn't know how to close. The bottom of the page approaching, I just put, good night, sweet prince. And then, crabbed into the margin, that's Horatio to Hamlet, and they were friends. Well, in this little role as Poet Laureate, which I'm very grateful for, I do see at least one member of the City Council here, Randy Rouse, and his wife Janet. Thank you for coming. Every once in a while, I get asked to write a poem for some community occasion. This last fall was nationwide, the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and there were several observances in town. And I was asked to write poems for a couple of them. And that poses a challenge. It's one thing to write a poem about personal loss, about a friend. How does one write a poem for a community, a city, or even a nation. How is one to be a poet to and for and within and on behalf of a community? So one of the poems I wrote was for a ceremony put on by our fire department and police department and many other uniformed services in a courthouse sunken gardens that Sunday morning, I think it was, this year. And I thought, well, I've really got to research 9/11. There's all sorts of things I don't know, and I need to read a few books and find just the right images. And, I really didn't do any of that. I realized that when I think about 9/11, I think of those firemen walking up the stairs. I think we all do. So that's what I ended up writing about. I'll read that poem to you. It's called FDNY. And did they climb those stairs? They did. Oh, yes, they did. Oh, yes, they did. And did they find their duty there? They did. Oh, yes, they did. And when those towers fell, what then? What did become of them? What then? They kept on climbing. Yes, they did. With all their heart, with all their will, they kept on climbing still. And are they climbing even now? And are they climbing now? Oh, yes, they are. They're climbing there, on stairs and towers everywhere, in boots and hats and heavy fare. They keep on climbing through that air to do their duty there. And do they still, with right goodwill? Oh, yes, they do. For me, for you, they keep on climbing, for they care to do their dusty duty there. And shall we bless them full and fair? We shall, oh yes, we shall, we shall. We shall bless them everywhere. We do bless them full and fair because, oh yes, because, oh yes, because they still do climb those stairs. Well, now it's time for the second William Wordsworth. Lived a long life, 1770 to 1850, formed a great friendship in his 20s with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a brilliant man, and like most brilliant men, Coleridge was a pain in the neck. And so though Coleridge brought out some of the best of Wordsworth, they had many fallings out. Coleridge married to someone else, I believe, started wooing Wordsworth's sister-in-law, if I have this right, had a drug problem, was a difficult person. And I want to read a poem by Wordsworth that's not often read, and I find not many people know. It's 1808, April 1808, and Wordsworth has come down from the Lake District to visit Coleridge in London and try to patch things together. They've met, and it hasn't worked. They're still not friends again. And Wordsworth leaves Coleridge's house and goes trudging up the streets. And there's actually a spring snowstorm in London, and he's trudging through the streets of London in the snow, a bit dejected about this friendship that's not working. St. Paul's. Pressed with conflicting thoughts of love and fear, I parted from thee, friend, and took my way through the great city, pacing with an eye downcast, ears sleeping, and feet masterless, that were sufficient guide unto themselves, and step by step went pensively. Now mark, not how my trouble was entirely hushed, that might not be, but how by sudden gift of imagination's holy power, my soul in her uneasiness received an anchor of stability. It chanced that while I thus was pacing, I raised up my heavy eyes and instantly beheld, saw at a glance in that familiar spot a visionary scene, a length of street laid open in its morning quietness, deep, hollow, unobstructed, vacant, smooth, and white with winter's purest white, as fair, as fresh and spotless as he ever sheds on field or mountain. Moving form was none, save here and there a shadowy passenger, slow, shadowy, silent, dusky, and beyond and high above this winding length of street, this noiseless and unpeopled avenue, pure, silent, solemn, beautiful, was seen the huge, majestic temple of St. Paul in awful sequestration through a veil, through its own sacred veil of falling snow. Something deeply moving about that image of St. Paul's behind this veil of snow. And I don't know that I can quite explicate the poem. I don't know if Wordsworth would be able to either, but feeling this crushing sense of failure in his friendship and lifted up to this sight. And so often we're caught between like that. By the way, in terms of choosing the exact word, sequestration, how about that? Pretty good. Well, I think I had this poem a little bit in the back of my mind. Sister Susan Blomstad at the Mission Renewal Center asked me to write a poem this past year for the 225th anniversary of the Santa Barbara Mission. And I thought that's challenging too, because the mission is so foundational to our city. It's a very complex symbol. And beyond that, how to write a poem that's both publicly appropriate and yet personally authentic in the same way. And I think Wordsworth was my guide a little bit. So here's the poem on the 225th year of Mission Santa Barbara, 1786 to 2011. After our house burned down in the tea fire, we rented a place on Laguna Street a few blocks below the mission. In the mornings, I'd walk the dog to the rose garden and through the high grass of the meadow underneath the bell towers, desperately in need of their blessing. I took comfort in knowing they had been there for a long time, shadowing others in their search for certainty, for something in their lives that would stay. Oh, I know those towers crumbled in an earthquake in 1925, and whatever had preceded them was reduced to rubble in 1812. And I also know that the Chumash were not altogether grateful to be herded into these precincts and forced to build that fern-covered dam on the creek. And the long abuse of those boys at the school, I know about that too. But driving home from work that winter, I often chose the longer route that brought me down the canyon to that graceful turn around those towers, rising above the rusty leaves of sycamore and the last of the sun. My gaze falling across the lawn to the tile rooftops of our city, the ocean beyond, the islands glinting like a promise. And I would think of those many friars, most of them so patient and humble, so full of faith, so dedicated to those who came to place their burdens on the warm stone of these steps that lead out from that sanctuary to the rest of this beautiful, suffering world. Well, I think things are getting a little somber. Was visiting a friend in St. Paul, Westmont grad actually, and his 6th grade daughter, Annie, had a new dog, a little dog, and it was just a delight to see this young girl and this little dog. That's all this poem is about. It's called Annie's Wish. Murphy, Annie's black toy poodle, is learning tricks. So far he can sit, shake, roll over, lie down, and stand on his hind legs for longer than I'd think possible. Right now he is learning about his feelings. When Annie says, "Be sad," he is supposed to put both paws over his eyes. So far, Murphy is not very sad. We are talking now about weddings, Annie's brother just having come home from one. Annie, I say, when you get married, if Murphy were to be in the wedding, what would he do? What do you mean? Annie says. She looks worried. Annie's father clarifies. What part would Murphy play, he says, in your wedding if he was in it? Then Annie knows. Murphy would be the flowers. Ah, I say, the flower dog. He would carry the flowers down the aisle. No, says Annie, Murphy would be the flowers. She picks him up and presses him close. I'd carry Murphy instead of holding a bouquet. What a beautiful day for a black dog. When Annie gets married, be sad, Murphy, be sad. How are we doing? Okay. Well, I'm going to read 3 more poems, and then we'll visit as long as you like, if you have any questions or comments. Some of you might have known a member of our community named Jim Blakely, and I only met Jim once, but he was, I think, active in the Boy Scouts, and he was a local historian of our backcountry, and I just came to interview him once about things like the Manzana Schoolhouse and some of those pioneers back in the wilderness. And I found him a fascinating man, and I must have talked to him just a few years before he died. And I tried to put down just one anecdote he told me, and he started telling me about a poet who lived in the Ojai backcountry in the late 19th, early 20th century named Frank Felt. And I've looked up some of Frank Felt's verse. It's a little like Robert Service, sort of these bumpety ballads and so forth. But he's ours, so we'll own him. And so he was showing me a picture of Frank Felt, who lived in the backcountry, but he had the garb of a mission friar on. So he was explaining what this was about. So I've called this, continuing our marriage theme, Frank Felt Gets Married. Don't let that picture fool you, Blakely said. He leaned back in his study, slipping down thick glasses on his weathered face to show eyes hard to know the truth about the past. Frank Felt, he lived way up the Sespe near, you know Pine Mountain Inn? You do? Well, there. Just near that spot, away back up the Sespe. And every year he'd make the ride to Hemet to play the part of a Franciscan friar in Helen Jackson's pageant. Every year, a pageant all about the early days. Helen Hunt Jackson, yes, she lived there then. You see, the robe is gray, And that's because the friars' robes were gray in mission days, not brown as now. And every year, Frank saw a nice young lady down by Hemet there. She wanted him to ask a certain question. He never did. Frank never thought she'd want to live way up the end of some horse trail. One moonlit night, back there up at his cabin, Frank hears the hooves of horses out his door. He steps outside, and coming up the trail, it was leap year, I should have told you that. He sees 4 horses in the moon, all gray. The first one carried the witness. On the second, the minister. And on the third, the bride. The fourth, it was her pack horse, loaded up. "You haven't asked me, Frank," the lady says, "but since it's leap year, I thought I'd ask you." That's how Frank Felt got married. Blakely's eyes were misty now, not hard with scrutiny. Before I left, he said, "It's not the same. It's not the same now as it was back then. The friars' robes were gray in mission days." Well, Frank Felt died around 1940, and soon after that, our third William Stafford, came to spend a couple years in the Santa Barbara backcountry. He was from Kansas. Some Mennonite Brethren influence in his past, and thus was a conscientious objector during World War II, the first war in which we made allowance for such. And he spent 1942 to 44 in the Los Prietos camp. Now it's the boys' camp there at the first crossing of Paradise Road of the San Ynez River. With maybe 100, 150 other men, they worked hard all day. They valued the life of the mind. They're too tired in the evening to read and write and talk seriously, so they made a pact to get up very early each morning to read and to write and to teach each other. I like thinking of that community of men, and that's where William Stafford got started as a poet and where he began his lifelong habit of rising before dawn to write a poem every day. He went on to become, to win a National Book Award in the early 60s and to become, the poetry consultant to the Librarian of Congress, the position that became our National Poet Laureate soon after. Taught at Lewis and Clark College till he died in Portland in 1993. But a generous man, a man who's inspired many writers in this room. And just a couple years ago, a book came out, Another World Instead, the early poems of William Stafford. It includes 50 poems placed and dated right at Los Prietos in Santa Barbara. It's not his best poetry, but it's beautiful to see. I especially enjoy this little poem, Los Prietos. Dear friends, the swarthy earth shoulders into the stars here. The slopes are possessed of many trees. The gracious sun visits daily the open parks, and a chaperone mountain serves all the canyon west. Deer timid through shadows, birds fly across from cliffs. Mostly silence rises and moves up the slopes past enchanted white spikes of yucca. This is the land we are exiled to from a world fighting. We look at each other and sing all the songs we have heard. That's William Stafford. I should say the Forest Service has given us permission to place a little plaque on the side of the camp with the picture of Stafford, and we hope this poem and a little about him. So that's in process. If that's a project you're interested in, let me know. because the Forest Service is not paying for it. Well, let me go out with this small poem, maybe somewhat influenced by the spirit of William Stafford. I said I would make it up to my wife by the end of the reading, so this is for you, Sharon. It's called The Good Portion, and that comes from some versions of the Mary and Martha story in Luke, where Martha's a busy one, and Jesus tells her that Mary, her sister, has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her. The good portion. Is it waking to this calm morning after a night of dry winds? Is it scrambled eggs, the ones with cheese, or the hot glaze of a cinnamon roll? Is it the way you laugh over breakfast, that generous gift, your laughter? Is it rinsing the plates and pans in the sink, or leaving them in a cockeyed stack, these things of use, these things of beauty that will not be taken away? Thanks.